bringing me back. I pray for the lesson today. I do pray for Dwight and Karen. I pray that you just get straight in, but make the medicine work. And I would love for him to be able to stay at home and not have to go to the hospital, just everything that's involved in that. Just grant him a great day today and help him begin his recovery period. We ask this in your son's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So this is exciting for me because normally, like Chad mentioned, I normally do 37:2 through 50:26 in like 45 minutes. So my normal outline of Genesis, and the reason is because the bulk of your sermons you're going to hear in Genesis come out of this area, this territory, for an obvious reason, which we'll get into in just a little bit here. So for me, this is going to be kind of fun. I got 3 weeks to do this, right? Which means, honestly, it's going to feel like my internal clock is going to be messed up, I'm just going to say, right? I think we should be going like this, and we're going to be like, breathe, take it easy. Let's work our way through it, right? But we are definitely in the home stretch. So we're going to do 2 weeks. We'll take a break for the Sunday after Thanksgiving. We'll come back, finish up this Toledo, then have 1 week to wrap up the class and the materials. And then we're going to turn you over in large part to the good graces of Deuteronomy and to Steve and Scott. So be praying for them as they pull that material together.
And George.
And George, oh, you got roped in that too?
Rope-a-dope.
Right, it is what it is. These things become black holes. So anyway, before we can move forward though, unfortunately we do need to move back because we essentially, as we've taught the class, we've gone from here to here because we did this first. If you remember, we started the class off with the Toledot of Esau to demonstrate the power of the form of the wording, the form of the book from a literary perspective, helping us to understand the interpretation component of it. So, we're going to begin with this. So I have somebody read for me just a handful of verses. We've done this before, but somebody break out Genesis 28:10 through 22 for us, please.
And Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran. And he came to a certain place and spent the night there, because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head and laid down in that place. And he had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants shall also be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you.
Great. Keep going, sorry.
Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. And he called the name of that place Bethel. However, previously the name of the city had been Luz.
Luz. Right. I love it, Luz. All right, so what did Jacob do as a result of his encounter with Yahweh? Pretty obviously, right? He uses the stone that he slept on, as a marker. And we talked about stones being a motif in this theme. He anoints it. Again, something unique. His parents had never done anything like that, right? He names the place Bethel, house of God, right? And then, of course, Stephen goes off and he makes this vow. Now, the elements of the vow are, I think, kind of unique, right? Because again, nobody else has done it. As God has encountered Abraham and Isaac, they've been silent by and large in the face of these kind of big promises. Here's the land, here's the people, all the earth is going to be blessed because of you, blah, blah, blah. These two characters before him never really interacted much with it from that perspective. Abraham would argue with God, of course, to sort of say, hey, I get the descendants part, but I have zilch, right? So that part of it would be there. But in this case, Jacob goes off and sits there and says a whole bunch of conditional statements, right? If God will be with me, if God will watch over me, if God provides me food and clothing, if God returns me to my father's house, then we're all good. I'm like, wow, okay, great. That's very interesting, right? Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, is at the end of this whole deal, what is fulfilled? Every one of these things, right? That's the interesting thing about this. What Jacob seems to focus on is if you read through the thing, God sits there and says, here are the big promises, and then God does what? He moves from the big promises to something specific to Jacob. And Jacob can go off and say what? If you will do these things, if, as you say, you will be with me, if, as you say, you're going to watch over me, if, as you say, you will provide for me, if, as you say, you will bring me back, then you'll be my God. Now, why do you feel, as we've gone through this and we understand Jacob, we understand he's a manipulator and he, works in kind of crazy ways. What's behind this? What else could be behind this besides just his transactional nature?
Lack of faith.
Lack of something, not lack of faith, but I do think there's lack of faith, but it's lack of what?
Knowledge.
Evidence. His dad has been promised what? The exact same thing we had in the prior verses. You will have descendants that you can't number. You will have this land that you're in possession of. You will be a blessing to everybody. His grandfather got what? Exact same promises. Jacob can count on his hand how many people among the descendants that you cannot number. 4, right? Mm-hmm. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah. None of this is coming to pass in any way that you would kind of think that it would be coming to pass, right? From his perspective, what's happening now is what's important to Jacob, right? He is a person who looks to the future, but God then gives him what? To use something specific. Hey, Jacob does a lot. He latches onto that. So if you can meet me in the little things, I'll trust you with the big things. Kind of seems to be the equation here, right? So then when we get back to the end of this thing, I can't read this unless I go from the side, right? It says at the end of his journey, he goes, I am Yahweh, the God of your father, Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your offspring the land that you are now sleeping on. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out toward the east, the west, the north, and the south. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Look, I will with you, blah, blah, blah. He does all this stuff. He lays it all out. And then, of course, at the end, when we're very end, he goes off and says what? The same kind of wraps it all up and says, all these things happen. And then he says this to him. He goes, I'm Almighty God, be fruitful and multiply. A nation indeed, an assembly of nations will come for you, and kings will descend from you. I will give you the land that I gave Isaac and Abraham, and I will give the land to your future descendants, right? What's the extra bit up here that we didn't get when we talked, when God interacted with Isaac? I kind of said it when I read
The
through.
kings.
The kings, right? We sit there and says that word right there. These kings will descend from you. Something that it was stated to Abraham in 17:6 and 17:16, kings will descend from you. That was not reported off to Isaac. It is reported to Jacob. And again, so the question that Jacob has to be asking himself as he comes to the end of this thing is, does Jacob or his descendants possess the land? And the answer is what? Do they possess the land? They don't, right? Are they a blessing to those around them? What's the evidence of that? What's the last big story we hear in Jacob's Toledot?
The friction between him and Laban,
there's much more friction. No, it's after Esau, after Laban, after Esau. There's a lot of friction.
Oh, when
You're gone. Keep going. What's the city named after the guy? Shechem.
Yeah.
Shechem, right? Are they a blessing to the nations, the people around them? No. They murdered everybody in town, right? In Shechem, right? Are any of these people kings?
No.
No, right? And it's with this in mind that we then go back to the beginning, because we covered this contrast
Quick
at the
question.
beginning. Yes.
Samuel,
Mhm.
he said, I'm going to be leading you, but the people wanted kings. He said, well, no, God's your king. But here he's saying, you will have kings.
Oh yeah. You were going to have kings, right? God was always supposed to be their king, and God will be their king. That's the whole point of the kingdom project, right? That Jesus will come and fulfill the 3 main roles: prophet, priest, and king. Okay, and so kings are going to come. In fact, kings are promised to Abraham, promised to Jacob, and Jacob promises the kingdom or the kingship to a particular son, which is one of the points that we're driving to here in the end as well. So with that king's thing in mind, all that king's thing in mind, then we need to go back and we understand how this thing wrapped up, right? When we talk to Esau, chapter 36 has 40 odd verses on Esau. And again, remember, who is Esau? Is he in the line of promise or outside the line of promise? Did he marry people outside the line of promise or inside the line of promise? Outside. Is he living within his father's blessing, under his father's blessing, or outside his father's blessing? Outside his father's blessing, right? He drives his own mother nuts. I mean, that's the ultimate insult, right? I mean, you as a son, you drive your own mother nuts, right? What's the interesting thing about him? What do we get out of chapter 36? He is the father of the Edomites. What is Edom?
Red.
Kingdom south of the Dead Sea.
Kingdom south of the Dead Sea, a big kingdom south of the Dead Sea, right? And we were told through 36, it doesn't just have chiefs, it has what? Kings. And in fact, the words used there were kings in Edom before there were kings in Israel, right? This contrast, right? And again, then what we're left with is the very next verse, 37:1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan, and then we would get into the next told of what became of Jacob in 37, verse 2. Esau is not a blessing to the nations. Esau is not even a blessing to his own brother, right? But that's not what he was called to. It is to Jacob that the promise of the seed from chapter 3, verse 15 is going to pass. The question has been all along, as we've traced it through, we basically traced it through a single son to a son of that son to another son of that son, etc., etc. And our only chance, first chance we ever had for any sort of bifurcation was Esau and Jacob, right? Two boys conceived. It's God's choice that there are twins there, and one gets the promise and one doesn't. But to Jacob, who has no sons at this time, he will ultimately end up with what? 12. Who ends up with the promise? Who ends up with the answer for this, right? And of course, the obvious answer would be who?
Judah.
No, God, people. Reuben. Reuben's the obvious answer. Why?
Firstborn.
It's the firstborn. Exactly right. And let me just ask you this question: as a firstborn, does anything go right for you in the book of Genesis?
Nor in life.
Nor in life, right? Exactly. It is.
I think for my career.
Stacy would agree. It is a tough road.
It is. The oldest child has it the roughest.
Yeah. Yes.
Amen.
So debate at lunch. That's what we need to think about. We'll separate the oldest from all the rest of you. Something like that.
Do we
Anyway,
have a show of hands of how many firstborns are in here?
sure. That's what see. All the firstborn overachievers right here. So.
How many babies?
Middle children, because I
Literally, all the middle children are sitting together. That is weird.
feel like we're used to being grouped up and ignored.
Fourthborn, just like Judah.
Judah, that middle child, is going to be the hero of the story, right? So what's interesting is that this firstborn, this reversal of primogeniture is one of the themes that runs through the book. Obviously, it runs all the way to the end because we're not per se going to cover this, but when Jacob is blessing Joseph's sons, he does what unusual physical act? Crosses his hands. He would normally put the firstborn on his right, the other one on his left, and he does what? Crosses them. And of course, Joseph is what? He's incensed. Because even as he is the firstborn of Rachel, he is way down the list, right? But he's incensed because he still holds to that same basic concept, right?
And he's pretty important.
And Joseph is a pretty important dude at this time, exactly right. So let's ask some questions on this list here. So if we got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, I'm going to cross Issachar and Zebulun off the list because they're named only in context with the other 12. So they never ever get their own part of the story. Starting with Reuben, what happens to Reuben? What is going to disqualify him?
He sleeps with his father's.
Maid, slave in the Hebrew, right? So he is off the list. So goodbye, Reuben, right? Simeon and Levi,
Are they the ones that killed the
Shechem.
city?
they're the ones who killed the city, Shechem, so they're off the list, right? So we're left with Judah on this list, right? Then you got Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. Okay, firstborn, Joseph, and then Benjamin, who comes along and his mother dies in childbirth, and she gives him a sad name. His father, seeing something different, gives him a more appropriate name from that point forward. Obviously, these are going to be favorite kids. Then we've got the two slaves who go off and give us a handful of kids. Again, all of these kids down below the line are only ever mentioned in context with what? The other 12. So all we're left with, if we kind of erase these guys, cross-offs now, these are the only people who show up in the story from this point forward. Now, when we look at the first, who are the next people in line, who are we left with? Judah and Joseph. Firstborn of Rachel, the next in line from Leah. Is it any surprise that the entire what became of Jacob is about these two people? The entire story revolves around those two people. And again, it's something I don't think that we go off and realize very often, right?
I can kind of see Joseph because Rachel was his favorite,
Right.
right? But, and then, so that would, Joseph would be the firstborn of Rachel would be favored, but beyond that, yeah.
Yeah. It's
And he did
interesting,
He
right?
did get a double portion.
He will get a double portion, exactly right. But he doesn't get the prize,
Right.
which is interesting, right? So when you go through this list, in my mind, this is an observation that most people go off and make. So we should expect to see that the story is about these two people, right? Now, something else before I want to leave this, because I think there's one more element that I think is very interesting in this. One, we're going to have, guess what? When we did Esau versus Jacob, what was the whole point of it? It was a contrast right from the birth narrative, right? They come out of the womb together, and they're as contrast as they could be, and that contrast and that conflict will exist throughout the entire storyline, right? This is going to also be a story of contrasts between the two heir apparents, if that makes sense, okay? Because again, Jacob's got what? He's got two choices, essentially, from a you know, if you haven't read through the story, you would think these are the two people. So this is going to be a story of contrast between Judah and Joseph. We cannot forget that as we move forward, okay? But there's one more little element that I want to go to, because normally it's something we talk about when we think about Cain and Abel. Who did Cain and Abel and Seth marry? Sisters. They had to, by definition, right? Now, when you get to Abraham and Sarah, Abraham makes a very legalistic argument that Sarah is what?
Sister.
Is a sister, right?
Sister.
Now, who do Isaac and Jacob go off and marry?
Cousin.
Cousins, right? Who does Esau marry?
Bad girl.
He marries a bad girl. He marries a Canaanite.
Yeah.
And then he follows it up with what? An Ishmaelite,
Ishmaelite, yeah.
right? And that was the parentheses of that larger group of stories and stuff like this, right? Let me ask you, the person who gets a double blessing in this case, Joseph, who does he marry?
Egyptian.
Does he have any sons
Two.
of import through a Canaanite or a non-Egyptian wife? No, from this point forward, Manasseh and Ephraim are going to be a mixed group just like Ishmael, Abraham and Hagar. Is that interesting?
Yeah.
Who does Reuben marry? Just asking to see if you guys took your coffee. We don't know.
We don't know.
Oh,
We don't know, right? We don't know, right? Same for everybody. Who's the only other person we know who they married on the list? Judah. Oh, isn't that interesting? Again, so back to the same thing. What are the parts of this that are important, that's been important to this whole story since Abraham?
Stayed in
Who did you marry? Blah, 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 right? The only two people that we know who married somebody? Judah and Joseph. Who did Judah marry, by the way? What's her name?
Mrs. Judah.
You are correct, because her name, as far as I'm concerned, is Mrs. What's Her Bucket.
Right, because she died.
Yeah, we'll read about it, but
Right.
do we ever get her name?
I don't think so.
We don't. Just a certain woman, right? Now, is she a?
Well,
she's,
we get her ethnicity?
she's a Canaanite.
Okay.
Exactly right. We get her ethnicity, but we never get her name. Now, what's interesting about this is that, to me, Judah sort of stands in as where did the 12 go to get their wives? They're all local girls. things have changed, right? And again, it's just very interesting because again, this backstory is certainly important, right? And yet, in this case, there will, from this point forward, be no more pure marriages with the girls from the north, if that makes sense, okay? Now, we need to keep in mind the themes that continued on in this narrative arc as we've talked about before, conflicts. In this case, we're going to use the word contrasts, even though there will be a conflict here pretty quick, okay? Treacherous, right? Moral ambiguity, an eye to the future, talionic justice. These were the themes that we talked about with Jacob. Now, Jacob has been the star of the story for a handful of Toledotes now. What became of Isaac is all about Jacob and Esau, right? What became of Jacob still is all about Jacob in a lot of ways, right? So as you think about forgetting what happened with Jacob and Esau, as you now think from Joseph and the brothers forward, can you give me some examples in this next 13 chapters of conflicts that we're going to see? Y'all know the stories well enough.
Selling your brother into slavery.
Selling your brother into slavery seems like a conflict, right?
Semi.
Also sounds like it's what?
Treacherous.
Treacherous, right? Exactly right. So
I was hoping you weren't gonna say moral ambiguity.
There's no moral ambiguity to that, right? The interesting thing about it, right, is why do they sell him? Why are they treacherous to their brother?
Jealous.
Because of the conflict, the jealous conflict that is set up by their father's favoritism, right? Where's the moral ambiguity?
Not sleeping with the quick or guard's wife.
So not sleeping?
Not sleeping with.
That's not moral ambiguity. That's a good moral act.
Oh, not according to her.
Not according to her. No, exactly right. But I mean, she's going to use it as an excuse, right, to get him in trouble.
Get him in prison.
No, I mean, you don't sell your brother into slavery. I mean, that's morally.
That's not even moral. Again, that's not, to his point. That's not even ambiguous.
No,
That's just
it's
morally
not.
wrong.
It's just wrong.
Right? Right? So do we have, can anybody come up with a moral ambiguity that we're going to be faced with moving forward? If not, I'll be.
The Benjamin stuff, right? It's a little weird to plant stuff on Benjamin and then
Thank you.
go find him,
Exactly
right?
right.
And be like, hey, who stole it?
Oh,
That's right.
okay.
Think about it.
Okay.
Who lies through the entire second half of the story? Joseph, right? He is flat out just making it up as he goes along, right? And yet he's doing what he is supposed to be doing in order to uncover it, to expose. An eye to the future. Who has an eye to the future in this thing? At the end of the story.
Is it Reuben that protects him and says, hey, I know that, let's throw him in here first so we can keep him alive?
Yeah, Reuben acts in that way. Not exactly what I was thinking about, because Reuben is definitely thinking about his own future.
Yeah.
Right, for sure, right?
How about the famine?
Yeah,
Joseph's the obvious choice, right? Because Joseph's claim to fame is to sit there and say, here's how we solve this impending problem, right? And then talionic justice. Y'all remember that? What I mean by talionic justice, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's poetic, symmetrical justice. What's talionic justice going to look like in this story?
Forgiveness. I mean, because
Jacob has to.
they
has
don't
to
receive the
flee.
justice they deserve.
He has to fear Esau.
Huh?
He has to fear Esau.
Has to fear Esau.
And he sends his wives and children and grandchildren ahead of him in order of descending or priority.
Importance, yeah, exactly, importance. So how does that then play itself out again in the story of what became of Jacob?
I don't feel, it's not are you trying to fish for when he's in prison with the cupbearer and the baker? I don't feel, maybe
No,
not.
that's not where I'm going with it either.
Okay, yeah.
So we'll get there. So if I just want you've got one more suggestion?
Joseph holds one of his own brothers in prison while they have to go tell the father that.
That is certainly talionic justice, right? He puts his own brother into a pit, right? It's a one-for-one thing, and when it happens, the brothers say what? God has done this to us.
Because of what we did to our brother.
Because of what we did to our brother. That's exactly an example of talionic justice. It's an eye for an eye sort of situation that then does what? Makes you stop and think about what's happening. I want you to keep these in mind, again, as we go forward with this whole deal. Now, one more thing that we covered in the last unit, but again, we need to really focus on, the reason we introduced it last time is because we're really going to use it this time. Because we're going to talk about how repetition and these techniques of using, in fact, certain keywords that become the idea throughout the entire story. And so when we did this back in Jacob, we used word motifs. I'll just bring all these up here. We used word motifs like the stone. He had a stone, he had markers. These things become place markers, as you would from a narrative perspective, not just a geographical perspective, okay? We're gonna see something very similar in this identity as well. So what I need now is somebody go off and read for us 37, 10 through 2 as we begin.
2 through 10.
Whatever. Pick your 8 or 9 verses you like. But I'm gonna
And read them backwards.
I'm gonna suggest what I actually wrote as opposed to what I actually said. Hey, jet lag. I get at least claim it for one more day.
All right, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamt. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf rose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaves." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dream and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers, and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves down to the ground before you?"
So, and we could actually throw in that 11, but we're gonna leave that, we'll leave it just right there for now. So, the question then is, why is Joseph hated by his brothers?
He's a little brat.
He's favored.
Jealousy.
It's just straight up jealousy, right? Favoritism, parental favoritism is.
And,
you know,
and
do
he's
we-
throwing it in their face.
and then it's before that though. I mean,
He's
you
a
don't even have to-
tattletale.
He's a tattletale,
He told on the 2 wives, he brought a bad report about them to their father.
exactly. And again, if you read through, we'll talk about this, right? If you go through this in verse 2, grammatically, it means it's a report on their evil activities. It's not just that they're being sort of mischievous or if they're just acting like boys. It's evil activities, right? And of course, what we're supposed to gather is Joseph's brothers are evil and unfaithful. And of course, what is Joseph going to demonstrate through this entire thing? He is faithful and good, right?
How old were some of the other brothers? Do we know? Because it said Joseph was 17, and because he was a child of his old age. So I'm wondering how much.
So I
How
actually
Reuben
covered
was.
some of the aging and stuff like this in the previous one. There's
Okay.
a lot of notes on
Excellent.
that one, so
Okay.
I'll let you bang on
Appreciate
that one. But some of them were probably 20 years older.
Okay. Well.
So so we have this that again he's hated by his brothers because of the parental favoritism. Let me follow up with this else. Who else was favored by a parent?
Benjamin, Jacob.
Jacob.
Jacob, right.
This is Talionic justice again, right? Jacob is the favored, right? But favored by who? His mother. Who was the other favored?
Isaac.
Isaac.
Isaac. Again,
Esau
well, Isaac was definitely favored by his mother as well, right? For obvious reasons, right? But Esau was fathered by his father, right? And we've seen parental favoritism in all of our major character stories so far, right? And of course, us as parents who all read, James Dobson, know this is the worst thing you
Yes,
can do, right?
no favorites.
No favorites, right? Even though it's fun, in my case, I can say I have my favorite daughter and my favorite son. So we have one of each.
I was the favorite.
But you were still the favorite.
It was. My mom would never deny it. She would just kind of smile and nod.
It is what it is, right? Now, again, it's his faithfulness that opens him up to being this tattletale, right? He is exposing their evil, and so they turn on him from that perspective. Now, again, we kind of go a little bit forward. Oops, I'm going to leave this right here. In verse 3, Jacob is favoring his oldest son from his oldest wife for obvious reasons, right? Now, one of the other things I think that's interesting is that how did the brothers react? Are they mad at their dad, or are they mad at the favorite son? Who's the one who's showing? This is Renee's dad's point. If you're spoiled, you would sit there and say, whose fault is it? It's not my fault.
Yeah.
It's your fault, Dad.
You spoiled me.
You spoiled me, right? And yet, what does this sound like? Cain and Abel. Abel's and Cain have this conflict, and again, Cain is mad at who? God, because he favors Abel's sacrifice?
No.
No, mad at Abel.
Yeah, he's mad at Abel.
It's just the wrong target completely.
It's even Adam and Eve. The woman gave me that you
Yeah, exactly right.
provided.
Yeah.
Maybe what's underlying that is I'm not living up to a standard, and therefore there's hatred towards the one who did live up to whatever standard that dad had.
That's right, because if I can eliminate the standard, then we all look the same, right? Sort of a deal, right? And again, this is philosophically why, again, you cannot raise all people up, but you can't lower everybody, right? You just whack them, cut them all down. And that's what the brothers are obviously gonna go off and do. So let's keep on reading. We'll get, and again, this is probably whacked on this deal, right? So we already did 5, we did through 11. We're doing great on all this stuff. Again, I cannot see any from far away anymore. This is so ridiculous, right? So if we go off and we sit there and say, then the dreams, that's what we're gonna get into, the 2 dreams. Or it is. So now, what are the 2 dreams? They have one meaning. What is the meaning of the dream?
They'll bow to their,
Joseph's gonna rule over.
Yeah, so let's put it into one word. Authority. Joseph has been chosen by God to exercise something that they all want, which is what? Authority. Okay? There's no mention. We always read into the end of the deal. The sheaves and whatnot all point to how he's going to arise to his level of authority, etc., etc. But all that the dreams mean is that he is the one who God has chosen to have authority, even over his parents. It's a bad deal from that perspective. Okay.
Look, I mean, that's exactly what, Isaac, that's what he knew right away. The parents knew right away that was the situation. The brothers just hated him. They were just mad at him for being, they were jealous of him.
Mm-hmm.
But the others knew that, the parents knew he's saying that he's got authority over us.
Yep.
What is this?
Well, yeah, and why is this?
Yeah, why?
Yeah, why?
Why are you dreaming something like this?
Yeah, so dad does this, God sort of confirms it, everybody's very, very mad at everybody now, and we're moving forward. So again, just as we had with Esau and Jacob, in the immediate opening of that story, we had what? Tension, right? A conflict was already set up. We're 11 verses into the first chapter, and where are we at? Same situation, right? The story of Jacob opens with the rift between the sons. Joseph is faithful, they are evil. Joseph is favored by Jacob and by God. They are not, okay? And again, it's all centering around God's choice of who is going to be the favored one, the one who's going to have this authority, right? And so what's going to be interesting about this is Joseph's story is now going to center around his being the chosen one of God's, and the one who's going to fulfill God's promise to go off and have this authority over his family. So let's keep on going, 37, now 12 through 25a. Somebody else.
Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." And he said to him, "I will go." Then he said to him, "Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, "What are you looking for?" And he said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are, pasturing the flock." Then the man said, "They have moved from here, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" Then Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. And they said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say, 'A wild beast devoured him.' Then let us see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father." So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the very colored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal.
That's it, stop right there, right? Then they sit down and stop to eat a meal. Just done. So,
They felt real bad.
yeah, clearly a lot of remorse on their part, right?
Well, it's a lot of energy to, you know, I mean, you
To
gotta,
grab a 17-year-old, it's 11 on one.
Yeah,
It's-
yeah.
It's always tough odds.
yeah, hungry.
Like, yeah, exactly, work up an appetite that way. So again, it's twice it's mentioned that Jacob is gonna go off and send his son, right? And again, Joseph then does what? Twice, essentially, is looking for him. Goes to Shechem where they're supposed to be, goes the additional distance to go off and find them in Dothan. What is the biggest problem that I have with Joseph in this scene? What is he wearing?
His tunic.
Yeah,
Yeah, his multicolored tunic.
Throw
Like,
it in their face,
seriously,
yeah.
dude?
yeah.
I mean, that's like, put a big sign up there, God chose me, and then wander out, and then see how your brother's gonna react. I mean, it's
Read
just,
the room.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I'm just not getting.
I've always read it as just extreme naivety. Is that kind of how you read
Yeah.
it as well?
Oh, that's it, but that's not knowing how to read the room.
Oh, for
right?
sure.
Yeah,
for
exactly
sure.
right, it's definitely.
I'm not saying it was the right play, but I don't read a lot of his actions as like
No.
spiteful or proud or something.
It's not, no, it's
more
nothing
of-
like that, it's just not clever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
The
it's
guy that gave him directions was probably somewhat amused that this pompous little guy with this beautiful coat was wandering around in
In
the
the field, right?
pasture
Exactly.
trying to find his brothers.
Like, exactly, it's just hilarious. And of course, what I think is just hilarious is where did the brothers go to work the flock? What city?
Dothan.
No, Shechem.
Oh, well.
I mean, it's like, oh my gosh, guys, leave it alone, right? Again, that's another thing that in their mind, my mind now, I think they're going to Shechem for the obvious reason is they know nobody around them, right? We heard that God has put a fear on them, and so they know that they can go to Shechem where they dominate and they don't have to worry about anything, right? It's craziness. By the time he gets to Dothan, he's pretty far from his brothers, right? Now, this is what's interesting. Unlike the deal with Esau and Jacob, there's no effort to redirect the blessing. They're just going to go off and do what Abel and Cain went through, right? I'm not going to try and emulate, Abel in any way, shape, or form. I'm just going to do what? Kill him, eliminate him, right?
Except, do you think Reuben has an ulterior motive
Oh,
of trying
yeah.
to save him for that?
Yeah.
For that reason?
I think so, because I like that word restore, right? The idea being is like, see, Dad, I can't be responsible. I am the good guy. Yada yada yada. Reuben will show up again later on,
Yeah.
as well, because
Well-
Reuben acts as a foil through this whole thing.
I have a note in my Bible that said the worst crime ever was to commit innocent blood so they didn't want to shed innocent blood. So Reuben was smart enough to know that would be a serious crime if they killed him. So he says, let's don't kill him, let's
Yeah.
get rid of him.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where Jude is going to land, right? Is to sit there and say, where we're at with this whole deal, right? But again, the important part is that there's no effort to rechannel the blessings at this point. So now let's move on a little bit, moving on from this, and we go on. I want to stay in this area, right? So this is answering your question here, right? Bringing it all up, right? I think Reuben's efforts, like we talked about, are self-focused, right? Now.
Because what would happen with Joseph if he would have brought his brother back or brought back
Yeah.
to Dad?
Oh yeah.
Dad, they all tried
Why
to
didn't
kill
you
him.
take care of them?
But Reuben saved me.
Right, Reuben
Right.
saved him.
Reuben saved me, right? It's definitely going to work out well from Reuben's perspective if that's how that turns out, right? Now, I sat there and said when we read in verse 2, that the brothers' actions were evil. So again, understand why I say that, right? Because they concoct this plan, which is evil, right? They're going to kill their brother, right? They're going to blame it on a wild beast. And then they go off and they say the end of it is this wild beast ate him. What wild beasts were actually present? The 10, right? Reuben wasn't there. The other, huh?
Just
No, it's the 10 boys. They're the wild beasts who go off and do what?
The real one.
They're the real wild beasts. They're the
Gotcha.
real evil wild beasts
Gotcha.
that they're going to talk about, right? Because when they're all said and done after the attack, what does the beast do after it attacks? It sits down and eats. What do the brothers do after the attack? They sit down and eat. It's exactly, they're painting their own picture and stuff like this, right? This is why we know the brothers are evil, because they've labeled the kind of behavior and then they act it out. it's remarkable, right? So then, of course, that's where we're at. So now we bring in Judah. So pick up from just this 25, the second half of that last part of 25, and then through 28.
And as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a camp of Ishmaelites were coming from gosh, I can't even read today, I'm sorry, with their camels bearing automatic
Weapons.
or man, gum and ball and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brother, what profit is for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then some traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to them for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph to Egypt.
Yep. And so we have this interlude, right? It's now Judah who's going to go off and do what?
Save his brother.
He's going to come to the rescue, right? Put that in air quotes because it's not really rescuing too much, right? But Judah starts to take on this sort of leadership role in this scenario. And for him, he goes off and you can put in whatever kind of stereotypical thing you want to go off and sit there and say this, right? But it's interesting to me that, again, he goes off and says, hey, there's no profit in just killing him. We can get rid of him and make some money. I mean, how hard-hearted do you have to be, right? And then he goes off and he sits there and says, why do we want to do this? Well, he's our own brother. He's our own flesh and blood. I'm like, wow, just not even capable of hearing your own words in your mouth and stuff like this, right? Now, of course, Joseph is going to be treated badly, harshly, but he is still what?
Alive.
He's still alive, right? Now, interesting enough, the text will pass over all of Joseph's sufferings on this deal. We hear nothing about Joseph, how he suffers for his, at this moment in time, righteous behavior, etc., etc. Everything is focused on who? The 10, right? The 10 brothers, and now under the leadership of Judah and their idea, right? So
This is interesting to me to sit there and think about how in life we all the time feel like we've been chewed up and spit out,
right,
but yet we're still alive.
Yeah.
God still has a use for us. We still have a purpose.
it's not over yet.
No.
And yet, that's the thing, because again, we will, and that's what drives me nuts about a lot of times Christian worship songs, or
Yes.
Christian messages, or even as we talk to people, our answer is, you just need a little Jesus, because why? He's gonna fix what's wrong with your life.
Exactly.
That's not happening here, right? But the interesting thing is, again, it's not the point. Joseph's sufferings are not the point of the story. What's the point of the story? How evil his brothers are. This goes back to verse 37:1. Jacob sojourned in the land of his fathers with his 12 bratty kids. And one of these kids is going to carry on the promise. Why does Esau have kings in his kingdom and Israel have 12 bratty kids? Because they don't have any character. That's the point of all of this to this point, right? They are bad to the bone.
I hesitate to say that's the point because, Joseph has character, but God doesn't raise him up in the typical way. God shows his power and glory through the suffering that Joseph goes through.
Yeah, and is that right? This isn't, you suffered for me and now I'm going to reward you. He picks him, and his picking him causes the suffering. That's right.
This is the Messiah ben Joseph, right? Joseph is the one his father sent him out there, and his brothers rejected him.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And we're going to see this again.
Yeah.
Yep.
Centuries later.
Yep. Now, and this is why you always hear lots of sermons on this part of Scripture, because why? We are told over and over again, you should be a lot like who? Joseph.
Joseph, yeah.
But I'm much more like the other brothers when God encountered me, right? So that's my problem with it, right? So let's move on real quick here. So now we're on to 31 through 35. I'll read those. I have to put way up here. All right. So they took Joseph's robe. So Reuben goes back and he finds he's not there. He tears his clothes. Hold on to that. He goes back to his brother and said, "What, the boy's gone. What am I going to do?" So they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a young goat, dipped the robe in its blood. They sent the robe with its many colors to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it. Is it your son's robe or not?" Right? His father recognized, "It is my son's robe," he said. "A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth around his waist, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will go down to Sheol to my son," mourning. And his father wept for him, right? Now, I mean, just think about how, you know, what they go off and do with this, right? They let a contrived object do the lying for them, right? Does anybody else have a different sort of translation for, verse 32? "We found this, examine it. Is it your son's robe or not?" What other words do you guys have there where mine says examine it?
Identify.
Identify? What else? It's just examine and identify?
Recognize?
Recognize. I like recognize a lot. I would hold on to recognize, okay? Because that's where this is going to go off and do, right? Now, again, one of the other things that they go off and they do with this whole deal, right, is, again, for me, I would say examine, recognize, look at, discern are the words I want you to think there. But holding that thought, how do they refer to Joseph?
Your son.
Your son.
Your son. Again, just continuing on with this whole deal, right? Now, of course, now that Jacob has his prop, he improvises his own part from this point on forward, right? He literally recognizes it. He goes, "It's my son's robe. It is therefore what? Torn and bloody. It is therefore the result of what? Vicious animal attack." Well, everything worked out according to how the boys planned it, right? Who else used a object like that to fool their father?
Jacob.
Would that be Jacob? Talion justice, right? So again, we get this idea too when you get to the end of this thing, right? The grief is extravagant, right? It's over the top. There are Hebrew commentators who will say that when you get to the Jacob's speech, it switches to this very formal, poetic kind of style of Hebrew, and the reason is because again, it brings out these extra emotions and stuff like this. It's a desire on the part of Moses to explain that he really and truly is inconsolable. Like it is the end of the world for him that Joseph has been destroyed. And we know that because when we saw before, Reuben saw that his brother was dead. What did Reuben do?
He tore his robe.
Tore his robes. In Hebrew, it's 2 words and a particle. I mean, that's it. Jacob is all of this stuff and more.
And he tore his robe.
He tears
These
his robes as
are
well,
easy to
right?
tear apart.
Do what?
These robes are easy to tear apart.
Apparently, right?
Single fabric.
Yeah, single stitch, right? It's a single stitch fabric, right? So anyway. Now,
So why did the brothers keep Reuben in the dark? Other than the fact that he wanted to preserve his brother's life and they didn't.
I have no explanation for that. You can imagine that there's activity as things are moving and going. Reuben's the oldest, and so he's still somewhat in charge of making sure other activities are happening. The others are doing what? You know, taking care of the matter, you know, that they've agreed to, you know, just grab him, put him in the pit. Reuben's good with all of that. Things go further than he wanted it to go, obviously. And so he's in this stuck position. He has to throw in his lot with the rest of the boys now.
It was easier to divide the shekels by 10.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's also true, right?
Get another 20 pieces of silver.
Now, I want to basically go over verse 36. That, you know, my translation of 36 begins with this idea of meanwhile. You know, if you flip over for me, I'll go over to the next page. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph to Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guard. Right. Originally, I think it kind of loses this unbroken narrative continuum, because essentially what you would have if you were doing this from a film perspective is you'd have a single shot with 2 focuses on it. As Joseph is being sold off, you see his father doing what? This mourning. These things are happening at the same time, right? And so you can get a translation that goes like, and his father bewailed him and the Midianites sold him. I mean, there's no break in this whatsoever. everything happening all together. So we come then to this word nakar. This is our leitwort. This is our word motif for this section of Genesis. Again, we talked about the fact that who else has already deceived somebody? It is obviously Jacob, who deceived his father in 27:23. But that word nakar is used back to back in 37:32 and 33. Back in Jacob, when he used in 27:23, it says he did not recognize him, Jacob, because his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau, so he blessed him. Again, using a physical device to fool his father. 37:32, they sent the robe with many colors to their father and said, we found this, examine it. Is it your son's robe or not? 37:33, his father recognized it. Recognized is the word that we're looking for. And so again, Alter, in his commentary, would sit there saying, nakar, the verb for recognition, stated by the brothers in the imperative, immediately reoccurs in the perfect tense, Jacob responding at once as the puppet of his son's manipulation, right? Now what's interesting about this is we're not done with this verb, as Alter implies in this statement. In fact, it's going to play a pivotal role in two very different encounters in which we, courtesy of our omniscient narrator, know something that the characters do not know. And we're going to see how that relates itself out as we go forward. Because this is the word that drives our whole thing on talionic justice in this section. So, with that, I would like to ask you to read chapter 38. And I want to set that up by basically saying the following. I went through, when I was a new Christian, I followed intensely Temple Bible Church. The pastor who led me to the Lord through a tape sermon series did a great job. He was always verse by verse. His whole career at TBC was always taught basically verse by verse. This is how he taught Genesis. He did 49 of the 50 chapters of Genesis. This is how he taught Genesis. He got to 37:36. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard. The next week he started with 39:1. Now Joseph, being taken to Egypt, an Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. Skip the entire chapter. We'll talk about why this chapter gets skipped, why all of the chapters in Genesis you have heard sermons on, you've never heard one on 38. And we're going to tie them together, and then more importantly, in the following week, we're going to tell you why it's there. So with that, your homework is read 38. Okay? Any questions or comments at the end?
What?
Yes, sir.
If you're Jacob, how do you recognize his coat that he gave his son if you can't see when he was many years
couldn't
early
see it,
before, couldn't tell this is my son? So this is years.
No, Isaac is the one who's blind. Isaac's the one who's blind, not Jacob.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, that's true.
That's right.
One thing to point out though is all these sinful people become the fathers of the nation that blesses us.
Exactly. Exactly right. It's stunning.
Each one of them.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because Joseph is the only one to this point who still seems solid, right? But again, remember, that's the point. We have our two characters, right? It's basically Judah versus Joseph, right? And who's winning in this deal so far? From this story, Joseph, right?
God.
Everything's God's winning.
Yeah.
Sorry. But the interesting thing is, we've only been introduced to Judah, and Judah in what? One little basic sentence. Hey, it doesn't profit us to kill our brother, let's sell him. And everybody goes along and says, that's a great idea. Now, the next thing you should be asking yourself is, well, who the heck is this dude Judah? And guess what? Next chapter is what? Judah. Seems like it makes sense, right? See how this is all working together, conspiring together?
No, I don't need to read it.
Yes, you do. Trust me, you do.
I find it interesting that when the famine comes and Jacob sends the 10 brothers to Egypt, he holds back Benjamin. And I wonder if it's because he suspects that the brothers did kill Joseph.
Yes, he may not suspect that they kill him, but he definitely knows that they aren't going to move to protect him. Because that's how he basically frames it with Benjamin. Last time I left my favorite son in y'all's care, he came back dead. If you think I'm going to put Benjamin in your care, it's not going to happen.
So how much younger was he?
Benjamin? Again, that's that other thing in there. I would imagine, because Rachel struggled obviously to have Joseph, and I think she struggled again before she has Benjamin. So I can see Benjamin being 5 years younger or something along those lines. I don't see him as being like a little guy, but he could be a teenager. Easily, right? So, all right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Woo, welcome back.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Cotter.